Okay, now Janine Randerson is an artist and writer and an associate professor in art and design at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. She's the author of Weather as a Medium. MIT Press came out 2 years ago. Okay, all yours, Janine. That's all introduction from me.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm giving you a Māori greeting, and thank you very much for that very brief introduction, Piero. And also, I'd just like to say that I'm also hosting Laser Talks in Auckland. So I'm co-hosting that with another colleague in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. And actually, when everybody globally gets a chance to travel again, I think we're one of the few places where we can still present our talks live too. So it's really nice to connect into this Leonardo forum. So thank you for inviting me. So in this talk, I mainly want to focus on my art practice, which intersects with environmental science. And also I often collaborate with Indigenous artists or with communities. So my art practice is very much informed by that kind of sense of place that doesn't necessarily come from a Western perspective. So I'm going to share my screen now, and the first image here is just an image from one of my works. Can you see that okay, Piero? Is that all?
Yes, yes, it's good.
Yeah, so this is a art.
Okay, so you were disconnected, I don't know why.
Okay, so it started again now, hasn't it? So yeah, this is a work that explores the migrating patterns of birds through the satellite sensors with a scientific research unit in Denmark, and also it traces some of their landing points. I often work on multiple round screens, and at the moment I'm working on developing biopolymer materials for these screens. I'll just see if there we go. So this is another work which I'm going to talk more about at the end of the talk, called Albedo of Clouds. So this work is very much followed my preoccupation with meteorological science, and I've continued to be interested in the satellite perception as well as our ground-based earthly experience of weather. So I'm interested in the sensory ways that we respond to satellite meteorological patterns, and also through sonification and through live recordings of clouds, how we might understand how the weather mediates scientific modes of knowing about the fact of climate change. So out of these curiosities as an artist, I wrote the book that Piero mentioned, Weather as Medium, toward a meteorological art. So this book documents an intensifying trend in contemporary art to use live weather or atmospheric data as a medium for art making. And of course, we read this very much in the context of the era of a climate crisis. So weather artworks, I focus in this book from artworks that are live, that are installational, or that work with weather data. So I start the book in about the 1960s, although there is an introduction which traces some of the long history of weather in art and also in cultural instruments as well. So weather artworks often simulate live weathers or even use live weathers such as mists or rain or generate winds. And they often probe our collective anxieties and raise urgent ecological questions about climate change, oscillating between a big picture systems view, such as in my work represented by the satellite, and the ground-based earthly perspective of how we see and hear and feel the weather. So this is one of the artworks from the 1960s that I wrote about, Fujiko Nakawa's Foggy Wake in a Desert. So she is an artist who collaborated with engineers on creating these fog and mist sculptures. And what really interests me about this particular one in Canberra is that those the kind of mechanisms that she engineered in the 1960s, together with Tom Mee, a scientist from Pasadena, are still functioning, and this garden is still producing mist for 2 hours a day in Canberra, in a place where there is very much a crisis of water. So what I liked about it is that little bird, so you can see a crimson rosella in the foreground there, I hope, actually come to bathe under her sculpture. So I see this work as made not just for human means, but it also brings the non-human plants that the sculpture helps to water and grow, and the animals start to learn to respond to this work. So that's very much a thing that I'm interested in the book, is how do weather artworks function not just for us, but also for our environments. So how can we invite non-human or more than human stakeholders into the frame? I'm also very much interested in how we respond sensorially to works made of from the cryosphere. In this case, this is chunks of ice from the Arctic that Oliver Eliasson brought into Paris during the climate talks in 2015, and they were re-exhibited at the Tate Modern. But they're works that people can touch, people can grieve over, and visually see something that often seems quite remote physically in real space. So I'm interested in the kind of direct encounter that what I'm calling meteorological art can bring about. And this is an artwork by Māori artist Lane Wairia, who is a lawyer in her background, but she started working with performance artwork. So this is a work which is part of her ongoing series called the Chasing Fog Club. And it's an online platform where she's invited participants to post videos of their fog chasing activities across property boundaries. So you're invited to, like the weather, move across boundaries that might be considered trespass. And in New Zealand, in a New Zealand context, there's a very different understanding of land and property and weather as ancestor, rather than the Western view of this regimented split off sectioning of land, and also of atmosphere often as well. So if you think of the controlling of radio spectrum atmospheres, for instance. And there's another dimension to this as well, because in Matauranga Māori cosmology, the wairua, or the spirit of fog, has an ethereal dimension, a kind of manifestation of ancestors' tears. And I'm really interested in Lane's work because I see this collision of the cosmological frame, but also the legal frame. And in the book, I often draw on the philosopher Hannah Arendt and her perspective, her idea that if we don't take in multiple perspectives or see things in more than one way, how can we expect to engage with a common world? And this is the last work from the book that I'm going to mention. This is Tomas Saraceno's work, Aeroscene. And these are inflatable sculptures, but also mechanisms for creating human flight. They sometimes have passengers on them. And he does them to create provocations around new directions for the aeronautical industry. So they're powered by heat, and aerosolar forces. And once up in the air, you can ride these, when they're a bigger scale, along the jet streams rather than powered by fossil fuels. So for Saraceno, the so-called free space of the sky is a metaphor for how we can engage in new ways of being and new ways of thinking. So the book takes on a kind of post-anthropocentric position that tries to decenter the human. And I draw on Elizabeth Povinelli's notion of a meteor-ontological power. And this is a kind of power that the weather has on its own terms, but also I relate this to how art as a kind of eddy of activity around the weather can perturb our current military industrial complex. And also I'm very interested in how artists can enrich the scientific hold on facts about our meteorological and physical reality. So artists such as Saraceno and Lane Warrior's work offer a kind of speculative ethics of engagement with our weather futures. And often artists also call for immediate change in the present. I'm interested in what I've called a kind of meteor-ontological art, which is orientated towards a future where human interaction with our natural and cultural resources needs to fundamentally change. So this is an artwork of mine that I mentioned earlier, another vision of it, which I made last year, and 2 years ago in Russia, and it was part of the Russian Skyland network, who I know have a long association with Leonardo, and this is one of the education spaces at the Hermitage. So I've used the translucent screens again, and these images of the brightness of clouds from a ground-based perspective, but I've also animated satellite images of both water vapor images and infrared images and visible light images. So 3 different kinds of images, which I collaborated with a satellite meteorologist at the Bureau of Meteorology in Melbourne on receiving these from a Japanese satellite that takes in the southern hemisphere. So this particular work was proposing this kind of mediated perspective between the camera on the ground and the machinic perception of the satellite. And I often leave in the glitches of the satellite or the kind of sun flares and flickers to which scientists would normally clean up or eliminate. I often kind of leave them in the data set. So these are projection mapped onto, and people would be lying below. Sometimes they're lying on bean bags or mats. In this case, they'd put some bean bags down for them. And I'm developing this work for a new exhibition that is opening later this month in Shenzhen in China called The Vibrating Clouds. And I'm introducing to the pairing of the meteorological satellite and the ground-based clouds images of the tiny ice or tiny bubbles of air that are fossilized inside glacial ice in New Zealand. So I'll get to those images shortly. So part of my new research has been looking at these ancient atmospheres contained in ice. And it should be an interesting exhibition that has got some of the artists I wrote about in the book: Thomas Saraceno, Carolina Sobecker, Philippe Ram, Dylan Scorfidio. So architects who have also engaged with creating atmospheres. And then I'm also interested in the history of cloud observation, and they had a beautiful copy of the Atlas of Clouds at Museum Victoria in Melbourne, which was the global attempt in the 19th century to try and gather different cloudscapes from all over the world and to also start to name and create a taxonomy of clouds. So here you can see the nimbus and the fractonimbus, which is a page from the Atlas of Clouds. And I became interested in the Australian contribution to the Atlas of Clouds and found some historical documents that showed government astronomers in Australia actually taking their cloud images for the Atlas of Clouds, and they tried to triangulate their positions and communicate by telegraph about where they were located so they could calculate the height of different clouds. So that was conceptually part of the experiment that I tried to do also with my ground-based locations. I was kind of triangulating with the perspective of the satellite. And there was also a publication of the Australian additions to the Atlas of Clouds in this publication on cloud observation in Victoria. So I'm quite interested in the historical histories in my work that inform how we observe and understand clouds today. So these are the raw images that I just got, thousands of still images from the Bureau of Meteorology in Melbourne. And the visible light is the one in the middle where you can see the half dark vision of Earth. I'm particularly interested in the idea of albedo and the white of the clouds that we can see. And this is partly because it's one of the controversial issues amongst climate scientists, whether if we blanketed the Earth in white cloud, it would reflect back the heat of the sun and we could somehow mitigate global warming. There are other propositions, such as if we painted all our roofs white, would that create enough reflectivity again to mitigate this issue of the warming clouds? So although clouds, if you think of a philosopher like Bachelard, are elevators of the imagination, I think when we think about clouds these days, they also provoke anxieties or make us think about possibilities of geoengineering. Clouds are no longer innocent, and that was something that I was trying to get through in these works. The image on the far side is the water vapor image, is an image produced by the radiation emitted in a region where water vapor is the dominant gas. So you can really see Earth as just enshrouded in vapor in that image. So to jump to the work that I'm making for Shenzhen, it's also including that satellite image, but I'm trying to think of atmospheres captured in these fragments of glacial ice. So I went to the South Island last year and went to this Haupapa, or formerly called Mount Tasman Glacier. And there are huge amounts of fragments coming off the glacier and washing into a glacial lake below the glacier, so that the glacier is carving off all these shards of ice, and you could actually pick up hunks of glacier at the edge of the lake and hold them and see them melting in your hands. So it was a very powerful experience, because glaciers are understood as a kind of barometer of climate change for environmental scientists. And also this particular glacier in Māori terms is very significant because it represents the breadth of Aoraki Mount Cook, which is the highest mountain in the Southern Alps mountain range. So it is like the breadth of the glacier. And in fact, Haupapa means a treasure box. So a treasure box of breath or wind in Te Reo Māori. So these treasure boxes are melting at this amazing rate. So recently I've been connecting with a scientist, Dr. Heather Purdy, who's a glaciologist in this region. And she and her team, pictured here, are taking measurements from deep inside the Haupapa Glacier. So now, rather than being at the bottom of the lake, at the bottom of the glacier, this is up on top of the glacier. Really dangerous place to go. So the terrain of mountaineers at the moment. So this is a rig that they set up to be able to take measurements of the melting of the glacier. And she used a similar rig this year to put a sound recorder down there at my request to start to record sounds for this new work that I'm creating for Shenzhen, the fossils of air. And we're also going to collaborate with another sound artist, Rachel Shearer, on future work that will gather sounds, but also sonify some of the temperature data and the measurements that are being taken in these rigs. So these are some of the images that I'm working with for the current work. So on the far left is a broken off fragment of the glacier that washed up in the lake. And in it, you can see tiny bubbles of air that might hold up to 100 years of atmosphere. So it would hold information about carbon emissions, about pollens, about the quality, the saline qualities of the air. But of course, to take that image, it was just melting in my hands. The center image is an image of an ice core taken from Haupapa Glacier, and that is held at the National Ice Core Archive. And it was collected by Heather Purdy along with Yue Morgenstern and Chris Kroger of GNS Science. So that's about a decade old. And they've also done scans of the ice cores to understand something about the successive layers of atmosphere over time. Haupapa is quite a wet glacier, so you don't get as much information as you might get from ice cores in Antarctica, for example. And then on the far side, these are stills, but in the I'm ultimately making a video work, is an ice core segment that I actually made. I was hoping I was going to visit the ice core archive, but because I couldn't, I thought, well, I'll make an ice core. So I made a frozen ice core and filmed the tiny bubbles of air that I captured as they melted. So it's a kind of fictionalized speculative encounter with an ice core. And much like the 3 different kinds of satellite images, I've animated these 3 kinds of glacier images for the work in Shenzhen. And so that's going to be on a separate screen to the cloud imagery and the satellite imagery. So the audio composition to this, which includes the sound of the glacier, I'm collaborating with sound composer Jason Johnston at the moment, but it also, again, fictionalizes what the sounds of a satellite or the sounds of a cloud might be, as well as combining it with some of these live recordings. So just to end, I guess what I'm trying to do by making an artwork out of something that is so rapidly disappearing is to think about our meteor-ontological futures. So what directions are we moving when this very valuable part of our natural heritage is disappearing so fast? I speculate that when you pair that with images of the water vapor taken from satellites or from clouds, we can see the interconnection of those 3 systems. And I also wonder, with something that is as ephemeral as ice or as cloud, if we're working with these things as our weather medium, perhaps there's some kind of answer to calls for degrowth or for for other ways of creating things rather than producing more plastics or making more stuff in the world. So when you're working with an eco-political agenda, to work with materials that are both deep in cultural significance, but also ephemeral and melt back into the earth. That's an important thing for my practice, and I can recognize it in the practices of many other artists at the moment. So I'll end that there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh my God, every time you do something with the share screen, I get disconnected. Anyway, hopefully everybody's still there.
Yeah.
So I have a question. I had it ready, now I have to reformulate. Culturally speaking, climate, the weather, seasons have been part of ancient rituals probably as long as humans existed. Of course, now there's awareness that we impact the climate and so on. But do you see yourself and the other artists in this sphere, in a sense, belonging to the same tradition of these ancient rituals that were around rain, around the change of seasons? Do you see a continuity there?
Yeah, that's a lovely observation, because particularly Māori cosmology, that is what I'm most familiar with, the idea that if you see the clouds or the wind or the rain as living bodies or as manifestations of the ancestors, of course you are much more careful and generous in your encounter. And I think that kind of attunement to weather, or that sensitivity, that thinking in that way can give you, allows for a different kind of sense of your own relation to atmosphere, and a really strong sense of when you're putting stuff into the atmosphere that is going to make it sick, and ultimately is going to make the humanity sick as well, and all living beings. So I definitely see it as a continuation of that. Certainly Lane Wairia's work as a way of engaging, but also there's a humor to her work as well, at the same time as she tries to make her point, because everybody knows how difficult it is to chase fog. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Very lovely presentation. And the book has a lot more interesting artworks there. I didn't want to pick my favorites, but I encourage the audience to go and check it out.